Hi. So today we are going to talk about Chapter 1 in the economics book. Now I just want to reiterate that these lectures are not meant to replace reading the actual textbook. So make sure you read the textbook. That said, it will hopefully be a help to people who are more auditory learners or who like to have some things highlighted that they can focus on while they're reading. So I don't really care if you read first and then watch the video, or watch the video and then read, but you definitely need to do both. So let's get started. So the world has changed a lot since, I'm going to put myself up here, see how that does, since about 1700. So this is a measure of what we call GDP per capita. GDP stands for gross domestic product. It's how much an economy produces in total over the course of a year. And per capita just means per person. So it's GDP divided by the population. Now, if we take a look at GDP per capita in a bunch of different countries, in from about 1000 to 1700, it doesn't change a whole lot, right? It's pretty flat. And then Britain starts to grow somewhere around 1650, and then they start growing a little bit faster after 1800. That's the Industrial Revolution. Italy's a bit slower, but they do catch up. Japan starts around 1870 or so. And then China and India really only start growing until 1980. And so one of the questions we want to ask ourselves both in this chapter and the next chapter is, what happened? Why did it happen? And can we make sure it happens everywhere so that everybody can enjoy these higher standards of living? So, oh, there we go. I need to clear all. There we go. All right, still learning how this works. All right, so as I said, we want some measure of how well off a country is. Now, we're not just talking about individuals, we're talking about the whole country, so we're going to have to rely on some sort of average. Gross domestic product is a measure of how much we produce, how much goods, services, etc. that we produce in a year, and then dividing it by the population gives us an average. Disposable income is another way to think about how much resources people have at their disposal. So disposable income equals how much you earn in total in the market, and we'll talk about what that means in a little bit, minus the taxes you have to pay to the government, plus any transfers that you get from the government. Now, these are both financial measures, right? So they don't measure a whole bunch of things that are important to people's well-being. They don't measure political rights. They don't measure discrimination. They don't measure clean air. They don't measure a number of things that make people happier. So we just want to keep that in mind, that this is not a perfect measure, but it is certainly related to how well off a country is. One of the little pieces of math that we'll do in this class is growth rates. So the growth rate, whether we're talking about a growth rate in GDP, a growth rate in the price level, which we'll call inflation, or the growth rate in anything, the formula is always the same. And all it is the change in the variable, so in this case, change in GDP, divided by the original level of GDP. So this little delta over here, I'll go back to the drawing. That triangle is called delta. That just means change. It just means this year's value minus last year's value divided by last year's value. So the t is just a certain year. It could be 2015, in which case t minus 1 would be 2014. So we will do a quick example here, and but it's really pretty easy, and you'll have some practice in the problem set. All right. Oh, I gotta move myself down here again. I hope that's not distracting. All right, so this is an example from the book. So GDP per capita in Britain in US dollars, I'm not sure which year they're using as our base year, was $21,046 in 2000 and $21,567 in 2001. So we want to calculate the growth rate from 2000 to 2001. So our t in this case, the year, is 2001, and our t minus 1 is 2000. So we can do this pretty easily, right? So our growth rate in 2011 is just 21,567 minus 21,046 divided by 21,046. One of the keys is to remember to divide by the first year, not the second year. And so in this case, you get 0.025, which is 2.5%. Okay? So I'll usually ask you to give it to me in percentage terms, so that in that case it would be 2.5. So here's another look at that graph of GDP per capita. And the difference between this graph and the other graph is in the vertical scale. So our vertical scale here is in what they call a ratio scale, and what you also might have heard of as a log scale. So that means that each distance on the vertical axis gives the same ratio rather than the same distance. So in this case, each distance doubles. So we go from 250 to 500, from 500 to 1,000, 1,000 to 2,000, 2,000 to 4,000, etc. And this allows us to see growth rates a little bit better. So a straight line means a constant growth rate. So as we can see, Britain, where the Industrial Revolution started, was actually not even the richest country for most of this time period. It was really Italy. Italy was richer because it was geographically in a great location between Asia and Europe, and so they benefited from a lot of the trade that went through there. You can notice that Japan, Britain, China, Italy, they were all pretty similar, right? With Italy and China being a bit richer, but Britain then started to grow a bit. Now this first growth is actually due to a really bad event. The Black Death that came about in the middle of the 14th century reduced the population, and because of that actually increased wages, and we'll see more of that in chapter 2. Increased wages, and then they were kind of flat, right? And they didn't really increase again until about 1650 when they started to grow. They grew a bit more in the 1700s, and then they really started to take off around 1800. Italy really didn't start growing until about 1850. Japan, while starting from a poorer base than Italy, started growing around 1870. And then, as we said, China and India grew much later, but they've been experiencing some of the fastest growth recently. So the book refers to this as a hockey stick, right? It's basically flat for a while, and then it shoots up. And so the question that we're trying to ask in chapter 1 is, what happened? Why did we get this hockey stick-like growth? Why did we experience something that for most of human history seemed like it was impossible? So in order to think about that, we want to step back a minute and think about what gross domestic product is actually measuring. And what it's measuring is the value of all final goods and services produced in the economy in a year. Now, we're saying all final goods and services because we don't want to double count the value of things that are sold and then included in another product. So if you think about a car, if Ford builds a car, they have to buy tires from a company, they have to buy glass, they have to buy computers, they have to buy steel and aluminum, all the things that go into the car. Now, if we count all of those sales along with the sale of the car, we're going to be double counting the value of everything. So we just want to count the final goods and services that are sold. Now, it doesn't have to be only sold to consumers, to households. It could be sold to businesses. It could be sold to government. It could be sold to people in other countries. But we want only to count the final goods. We also don't count used goods. So if you sell your used Ford, that doesn't count because we already counted it back when it was produced. It doesn't count any production you do at home. So if you cook your meal at home, the value of the food that you bought at the grocery store is counted, but the value of that work that you did at home doesn't count. The cleaning that you do at home doesn't count. The child care that you do at home doesn't count. There's no way to measure that value, and so we don't include it. It also doesn't include a whole lot of things which are important for people's well-being. Things like inequality, right? How is income distributed? Two countries can have the same GDP per capita, but in one country, most of the income might be going to the very rich, with not very much going to everybody else, whereas in another country, it's more evenly distributed. It also doesn't include things like environmental conditions, right? So if we are getting rich by just spewing out a whole lot of pollution, we're not going to capture that. And that's going to be one of the things that we talk about both at the end of this chapter and in chapters to come. So here's a little bit from the Einstein section at the end of the chapter. Make sure you read those Einstein sections. They just give you a little bit more grounding in the math. So calculating GDP theoretically is pretty easy, right? So we take all those final goods and services. We're going to call them I, right? So there might be, in a country like the United States, there might be 100,000 different products and services. And then we're going to multiply how many we sold, that's the Q, the quantity, times the price. And then just add them up for all the goods and services. This gives us something called nominal GDP. Now, the distinction between nominal values and real values are very important in economics and especially in macroeconomics. So a nominal value means that we are calculating something in the current year's prices. But prices can change over time. And so when we're comparing GDP either over time, say from the end of World War II to now, or across countries, like between the United States and France, or Germany, or Japan, or China, we want to try to use some sort of constant prices. And so real GDP uses a base year for prices and says, all right, we're going to use these prices instead of using the prices for 2011, in 2011 GDP, we're going to use some base year prices. And sometimes the government updates that year. So I think right now, most of the time, if you go and look at government data, it's 2009. Although if you look at some government data, it's still like 1983. So that can be a little confusing because the dollar has changed in value quite a bit since 1983. When we're comparing across countries, there's a number of ways to do it. Sort of the quick and dirty way to do it is just to use the exchange rate, right? How many euros for the dollar? We use that, we can compare GDP between France and the United States. That's not usually the best way because those exchange rates are measuring a whole bunch of different things, not necessarily the relative value in terms of purchasing goods and services. And so what the best way to do it is to use what's called purchasing power parity dollars, or often just abbreviated PPP. So if you're looking at data for different countries, the best thing to do is to look for real PPP dollars. And that way you know that you're comparing apples to apples. And what that tries to do is say, all right, we want to adjust our numbers so that $1,000 in the United States buys the same as $1,000 in France, and buys the same as $1,000 in China, or buys the same as $1,000 in Brazil. So we'll have an example of how to calculate that in the problem set, but just know that it's always price times quantity for each good and service, and then you add it all up. For nominal GDP, it's using that same year price and quantity. For real GDP, you use the base year prices, or the PPP prices, and whatever year's quantity you're calculating. So the government plays, in some countries, a very big role. Like over 50% of GDP is produced by the government. In the United States, it's less. It's more like 30% of GDP. It's about the same in Japan. But it varies a lot by country. So one of the differences between a market purchase and a government purchase is that when a government provides a good or service, it's valued based on the cost to produce that. Now, in a perfectly competitive market, that won't make a big difference because firms will basically price at their marginal cost. But markets are usually not perfectly competitive, and so a government-produced good and a private market-produced good might have different costs, different prices, but really be the same in terms of quantity. So in the United States, education is probably the biggest piece that's produced by government, but of course there is the military and national defense. A big piece of healthcare is produced by the government in terms of Medicare and Medicaid. And then things like infrastructure construction. In other countries, all of healthcare is produced by the government. And so that can be a bigger piece, although in the United States, healthcare is almost 20% of GDP. It's a smaller percent in other countries, even though we tend to have about the same outcomes, at least in terms of countries that have a similar level of GDP per capita. So how did this hockey stick come about, and what was really going on? So we're going to talk about a few revolutions. One is the Industrial Revolution, but what goes along with that and really is both a requirement and a necessity for the Industrial Revolution is the Technological Revolution. And it's really hard to say which caused which, right? It's a case where they both required the other one. The book has a number of examples where technology just exploded in the 19th and then the 20th century. So one example is just the amount of light that can be produced per hour of labor. So, it sort of was stuck here around 15 lumens per hour, and now it's over 10 million lumens per hour, right? Light is not a problem in a modern industrial economy, whereas back before electrification, it was a big problem, right? Back before gas lamps, you basically went to bed when the sun went down, because otherwise you were going to be burning expensive candles. Another example of this technological revolution is the speed at which information travels, right? Of course, now information travels immediately. But back before the technological revolution, information traveled basically at about a mile per hour, right? You couldn't go a whole lot faster. Of course, you could cover short distances faster on a horse, but for the most part, a mile per hour was about as fast as information was going to go. That increased, right, with ships. It increased with trains. It increased with the telegraph. It increased with the telephone. It increased with the airplane. And now, of course, with the internet, it's basically as fast as the speed of light. As soon as something happens across the world, everyone can know about it almost immediately. Along with this growth in GDP per capita and the technological revolution has been a population growth. And now this has been fueled by another revolution, which is the healthcare revolution. And so around the turn of the 20th century, we had a number of huge improvements that allowed population to grow rapidly, right? So one of them was just an increase in public sewage, clean water. Another was antibiotics and vaccines. And this allowed population to grow very, very fast, right? And people were actually quite concerned with how fast population was growing, right? We can see that population was under 1 billion people until about 1800. And it took almost 130 years to reach 2 billion. But between about 1920 and 2000, we reached almost 7 billion. And of course, we're over 7 billion today. This was due to a huge fall in the death rates, right, especially among children. So infant mortality fell, child deaths fell, and an increase in lifespan, which was not matched by a fall in birth rates. The interesting thing is that now we are a little less concerned, right? We can see that the population, which had exploded, is seeming to slow down. And so now when you look at projections of growth, so this goes out to the year 2050, they tend to top out between 10 and 12 billion people. Now, why is that? What's going on? Well, the reason is that our population growth rate has fallen. So we are right around here right now. You can see our annual growth rate of population is just over 1%, but it's expected to fall below 1% by 2050. And you can see if this continues, it will eventually fall to 0%. Will it become negative? Maybe, I don't know. But that's an interesting question. And one of the reasons for this is that as countries get richer and as they move from an agricultural society to an industrial society and then a service society, children become less of an asset and more of an expense. And so some economists think that people choose quality over quantity when it comes to children. And therefore, as countries' GDP per capita increases, we tend to see a decrease in the birth rate. And actually, if we look at birth rates in Europe, in the United States and Canada, in Japan, we see that the birth rates for the native-born population in those countries is actually below what would be needed to replace that population. And so, the reason that the country's population is growing in the United States is really because of the increase in immigration. And that's true of a number of countries. And a country like Japan, which does not have much immigration, has seen their population actually start to shrink. So another important factor in this chapter is the idea that the economy is one piece of our human society, right? So we have in this graphic on the bottom here, the economy inside society, right? So there's a whole bunch of human society that takes place outside of economics. And then that society itself, of course, is placed within the biosphere, basically just meaning, hey, we're all on this planet, we're not going anywhere else anytime soon, and so we have to think about how all of these things interact. And so one example of this is the amount of carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere. And you can see that we have another hockey stick graph, right? Atmospheric CO2 was pretty flat until about 1800, and then it started increasing rapidly. And that is because of an increase in fossil fuel burning, as well as things like industrial-sized farming, especially animal husbandry, cattle, pigs, etc. So we're going to talk about that, what to do about that, how to think about that, what are the best solutions for that, and thinking about the balance between economic growth, lifting people out of poverty, and at the same time making sure that we don't use up the only planet that we have. So what are the environmental consequences of economic growth? Well, so far, some have been able to be controlled, right? So every city, every country that has industrialized has experienced these local impacts, pollution. So the London smog, smog in LA, the current pollution problems in cities like Mexico City and Beijing, deforestation, acid rain. These problems are ones that look like they can be controlled, right, with some smart regulations. So, for example, with acid rain, the problem was that we were putting too much sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. And so in the United States, we introduced a cap and trade system in which firms were given permits to pollute that would fall in value, and that they could sell to other companies if they were able to reduce their sulfur dioxide emissions even lower. And that has reduced acid rain quite greatly. And so some problems are definitely solvable. The big problem that we don't know is solvable yet is global warming or climate change due to this increase in greenhouse gases from burning fossil fuels. So we can see this graph shows that compared to the mean temperature between 1961 and 1990, we're already 0.6 degrees warmer, and that was only up to 2000, right? And as we've seen over the last 3 or 4 years, those temperatures have continued to rise. And so this is going to require not local solutions, because it's not a local problem, but rather global solutions, because it's something that affects the entire world. And we'll talk about what some of those solutions might be and why they haven't been enacted as strongly as perhaps they could be. So in economics, we think about how things get produced. And the major system that has been shown to be the most successful is capitalism, right? It's not the only solution. The government could be in charge of everything and tell firms how much to produce, what to price it at. That's usually referred to as a command economy or communism. In capitalism, the idea is that firms, right, which are political entities, right, they're created by political institutions, produce goods and services that they sell to individuals, to other firms, to the government in markets. They compete with each other, and that's going to be one of the most important parts of capitalism. And they are able to benefit from this because of private property, right? So private property is the idea that if something is privately owned, the owner gets to decide what to do with it. They get to benefit from it. They get to sell it if they want to. And capitalism has really played the largest part in this hockey stick growth. But also what we've seen is that there's lots of varieties of capitalism, right? So sort of what was called laissez-faire capitalism of the 19th century in both the United States and Europe was pretty brutal. It involved child labor, it involved sweatshops, and we've seen that those same things happen wherever capitalism has spread. But governments have been able to reduce those problems, and capitalism can still help an economy thrive. It just often needs a certain amount of regulation, sort of rules, in which to do so fairly and equitably. So private property is going to be a key thing, and private property seems like a straightforward thing, right? If I have a phone, that's my phone. If I have a house, that's my house. If I have a car, that's my car. But it's actually pretty complicated, right? Because it requires a whole bunch of institutions, government organizations that allow people to claim ownership, right? So if you want your car and you want to sell it, well, whoever buys that car from you wants to know that you own that car legally, and somebody else isn't going to come along and say, hey, that's my car. And so the government has a institution that says, all right, we have a registration, we have a title, this is the rightful owner of the car, this person is able to transfer that title over to another person. And that is true of most products and services, right? And the bigger the product or good, the more important these institutions are. So for instance, home ownership. The title of your home is extremely important because it lets you sell it to someone else. It lets you get a mortgage from a bank so that you can buy the house. And so private property, while extremely important, is not the easiest system to put in a country that doesn't already have it. Markets are their second piece of capitalism, and it's basically where people buy and sell goods and services. They have to be voluntary, right? And so whenever somebody buys something voluntarily, we can be sure that there is some mutual benefit between the buyer and the seller. Now, that benefit might not be equally split, right? It could be that the buyer gets more value, it could be the seller gets more value, but if they don't both benefit, then one of them will just walk away. So that's important to remember. And then firms are this legal organization that takes inputs. Now, inputs could be anything from, they're going to need some labor probably, so workers, capital, which includes things like factories and machines and trucks and computers, and raw goods and materials, things like iron and aluminum and corn and soy, and produces something, some output that they sell. And they at least need to cover their costs, and if they don't, they'll go out of business. And if they do, and they can make a profit, then their owners will benefit. And so sometimes an owner of a firm is just one person or one family. Sometimes it's thousands and thousands of shareholders that are spread out throughout the world for these large publicly traded firms. So just like we had the technological revolution, along with that was this capitalist revolution, which is kind of another term for the Industrial Revolution, although it's a little bit different because it required all of these institutions, right? The Industrial Revolution, I guess you could say, encompasses both the capitalist revolution and the technological revolution. Firms competed, and some firms were better able to produce than other firms. They grew. Other firms went out of business. There were incentives to create new products, to develop property, to sell products and services that people want to buy. And then government played a role too in providing infrastructure, providing rules of the game, providing institutions to protect private property, providing ways that workers could be protected or not, depending on the country and time, providing education for those workers so that they could be more productive. And all of this really increased the ability of countries to hit that curve of the hockey stick and finally grow where for the past 2,000 years they really hadn't grown in terms of GDP per capita. So capitalism is a complicated thing, and as I said before, there's lots of different flavors, but some countries have found it really difficult to put in any kind of capitalism. And where capitalism isn't successful is when we see that private property is insecure. They don't have the institutions in place where people can lay a strong legal claim on their own property. One of the key things in the United States has always been really competitive markets where the losers of a market go out of business. And it's often referred to as creative destruction. We'll talk a little bit more about that in chapter 2. Whereas some other countries tend to monopolize their economic winners, meaning that there's really only one company and nobody goes out of business. And some people are worried in the United States that we're moving more from a competitive model to more of a monopolized model. And that's one of the things that we'll talk about a little bit when we're talking about growth. And then finally, these firms, right, their leadership, their executives, have to be the people who are most successful at doing what they're doing, right? They're not the president's brother. They're not the founder's grandson or granddaughter, because those people might not be the most successful. And if there isn't competition and those companies are still allowed to stay in business, then we won't really get the growth that we've associated with capitalism in the past. So we can see some of this happening recently in terms of countries that have been able to institute systems of private property and markets and firms, with South Korea being one of the prime examples. So we can see that after the Korean War ended in the late 50s, South Korea was a pretty poor country, right? They were not much richer than Botswana and Nigeria. They were significantly poorer than countries like Argentina and like the former Soviet Union. But starting in the 60s and 70s, they put in a lot of institutional reform. they increased their education levels, and they really started to grow quite rapidly. And so that now they are one of the rich industrialized countries of the world and have some of the most technologically advanced companies in the world. Whereas these other countries have not been able to successfully put in these institutions that are needed for growth. So Argentina, which around the turn of the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century, is one of the richer countries in the world, they really haven't seen their GDP per capita grow as much as they would like, and they've had a lot of ups and downs. The same is true of Russia and the former Soviet Union. Brazil has seen some growth recently. It's been a little bit slower than perhaps they would like, and very recently they've had some trouble. Botswana is one of the bright spots in sub-Saharan Africa, but sub-Saharan Africa as a whole has seen very low growth with just a few exceptions. So just like there's lots of different forms of capitalism, there's also lots of different roles that the government can play. So this is just a measure, this graph shows a measure of how much the government produces in terms of GDP. And as we said, in the US it's right around 30%, right? US and Japan are pretty similar in terms of the government's role in the economy. But other countries are above 50%. So these tend to be European countries. They tend to be more Northern European countries. But countries like Norway, Denmark, Finland, Sweden, France are all over 50% of the economy provided by the government. So what do they provide? Well, it's going to be education. It's going to be healthcare. It's going to be infrastructure construction. There's going to be a lot more government employees doing things that we do in the United States, but by workers that are not private workers working for a private firm, but rather government workers. So one problem with economics is that, for a science, you really need to be able to do experiments. And especially in macroeconomics, we really can't do that many experiments. And so we kind of rely on history to do natural experiments. So when, for instance, at the end of World War II, Germany was split between West Germany and East Germany. West Germany became a capitalist/socialist country. East Germany was behind the Iron Curtain and had Soviet influence. And what we can see is that, while East Germany was always a bit poorer than West Germany, East Germany grew much more slowly than did West Germany. So this is a ratio scale on the vertical axis, and so you can see the higher slope of the green line for West Germany meant that they ended up significantly richer before reunification in 1990. And a lot of reunification has been about trying to even that out. You can see that Japan, which was after World War II the poorest of these four countries, was able to grow very rapidly up until sort of the mid-70s. They slowed down a bit then, but they also became one of the richer industrialized countries because of changes in institutions that were similar to those in West Germany, similar to those in South Korea. So the last piece that we want to talk about in Chapter 1 is this idea of inequality, right? So inequality has been really important in the last 40 years. It looked like we had really reduced inequality, going from the Great Depression to about the mid-1970s, at least in the United States. But since the mid-1970s, inequality has been increasing. And so we're going to talk about two ways that we can measure inequality. One is the Gini coefficient. The Gini coefficient basically shows how any quantity is distributed between the population. So we could talk about income inequality or wealth inequality, right? Income is how much you earn over the course of a year. It's a flow variable. Wealth inequality measures how much people own, right, at any point in time, and so that's what we call a stock variable. So the Gini coefficient goes from 0 if everybody's completely equal to 1 if one person has all of the income or all of the wealth. And it's calculated from something called the Lorenz curve. These are two Italian economists that came up with these measures. So here's an example of a Lorenz curve. So on the horizontal axis, what we have is people lined up from the poorest at 0 to the richest at 100. And then on the vertical axis, we have the cumulative share of income. So for instance, this red line shows the market income. I think this is for the Netherlands, but it doesn't really matter. Shows that the bottom 40% basically have only 10% of the market income. That's what that point is saying right there. Whereas the bottom 80% have about 55% of the income. And of course, once we get to 100% have 100% of the income. Now, what's the difference between the red line and the blue line? Well, the red line is market income, how much you earn in the market, right? And the blue line is disposable income, how much you actually have to buy and sell. And so what we can see is that the difference here is that taxes and transfers make this country less unequal, right? Now the bottom 40% has 25% of income, and the bottom 80% has about 65% of the income, right? And of course, still, 100% will have 100% of disposable income. The Gini coefficient is just one number that can summarize a Lorenz curve. And so it's the number between the graph and this 45-degree line, right? That's called A prime here, and the triangle area underneath the 45-degree line. That 45-degree line is perfect equality, right? 10% of people would have 10% of income, 50% of people would have 50% of income, etc. So the Gini coefficient can be 0 if the income is just up along this line, or it can be 1 if just one person has all the income, and so the triangle is the same for the numerator and the denominator. So here's an example with the Netherlands and the US. The US is in yellow here, and the Netherlands is in blue. And you can see that the US is a little less equal than the Netherlands in terms of disposable income. So remember, disposable income is after you've paid your taxes and you've gotten transfers from the government. And we can see that, for example, in the Netherlands, the bottom 20% have about 10% of disposable income, whereas in the US, they have only about 7% of disposable income. And the bottom 50% in the Netherlands have about 33% of disposable income, while for the US, it's about 25%. So we can also look at different Gini coefficients, and we can look at both the market Gini and the disposable income Gini. So the difference here is how much the government tries to redistribute income. So you can see for market Gini, it varies a lot, sort of between about 0.35 and even above 0.6, with South Africa being one of the highest countries. But even Hungary, for example, having a lot of market inequality, but reducing that number quite a bit. We'll see they actually have the highest ratio of market Gini to disposable Gini, and we'll look at that in a minute. The US is over here. You can see we have one of the higher market Ginis, but it's not that much higher than most countries. And there are certainly plenty of countries that are higher, but we're towards the right in terms of disposable income Gini. And actually, there's really no rich countries that are more unequal than us in terms of disposable income. So we can sort of look at how countries decide to redistribute income, right? We said Hungary does the most, but then countries that you would expect, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Ireland is there. and then countries that do the least tend to be poorer. Why is that? Well, it's not necessarily because they don't want to reduce income inequality, but it's often harder because they don't have the institutions in place. Right? They might not have the institutions in place to automatically collect taxes, to automatically give transfers. And so those take some time to implement. And so usually as countries get richer, they are more able to successfully redistribute income. Here's a look at the United States over time with a slightly different measure. So instead of looking at the Lorenz curve or the Gini coefficient, we're looking at how much of income goes to three different groups. So the black line here is the top 1%, and this is market income, not disposable income. The blue line is those 4% underneath that top 1%. So we've got the top 1%, and we've got the 5 to 1%, and then the red line is the 5 to 10% at the top. And you can see this was, the top 1% was incomes above 443,000. The top 5 to 1% was between 180 and 443, and then the top 5 to 10% was 125,000 to 180,000. And you can see that the blue line and the red line have been slowly increasing since the end of the Great Depression. So the blue line's gone from about 12% to about 17%. The red line's gone from about 10% to about 12%. The biggest change has been in the 1%, which saw their share of income fall steadily until about 1975, 1978, when it reached a low of about 8%. And then, I have to move my video because it went so high, we're now back above 20%. Right? You can see it goes up and down a lot because one of the things that is true of the 1% is they get a lot of their income from capital gains, selling and buying stocks and bonds and houses, business income, which tends to go up and down with the business cycle. But basically, we're at the same level of inequality we were at before the Great Depression. And so we'll talk about that as well, and hopefully we'll have time at the end of the class to do the chapter on inequality. So, what is economics? Well, this is a graph that's often referred to as the circular flow diagram. And what it's saying is that firms produce goods and services and sell them to households. Households give labor to firms. But we've added a few things to our usual circular flow diagram. One thing that we've added is this biosphere, right? And so the biosphere gives us land, it gives us raw materials like iron, it gives us energy and water, and we put out pollution and waste, both on the firm side and on the household side. And then, of course, there's a lot of labor that goes on in households that's not measured, right? Caring for children, caring for older relatives, cleaning, cooking, all of that stuff goes on in the household. And so it's important to remember that we need to think about sort of everything when we're thinking about people's choices, when we're thinking about how the economy is related to the world, and where we fit in this picture. So that's the end of chapter 1. This was a pretty long video, a little bit longer than I meant to go. Hopefully it was helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to go to the discussion forum and ask me. Otherwise, get started on that problem set and